Hey guys, wanted to tell you real quick about our podcast host and sponsor, Anchor.fm. If you're thinking about starting your own podcast, I highly recommend Anchor. It's free. There are creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. They'll distribute your podcast for you, so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more. And you can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast all in one place. Download the free Anchor app or go out to Anchor.fm to get started. That's Anchor.fm. Now back to the show. The Cannabis Sells Me Podcast, episode 115.
You're listening to the Cannabis Heals Me podcast, where we explore the real stories of real people who have discovered the profound healing properties of the cannabis plant in their own lives. Find more at cannabishealsme.com.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Cannabis Sells Me podcast. This is your host, Rachel Kennerly, and we're recording once again, or I am recording once again, at the Storybook Inn Studios. Thank you so much for joining me today. I have a tax filing deadline next week, so I'm not going to do the things that I normally do, which is tell you to subscribe to the podcast, go out and give us a rating or review. We need to get right into the meat of the podcast. I'm also going to go ahead and give you a heads up that this interview has not been edited because I'm running short on time. I promised you guys this content, and I don't want to not give you guys what I promised to give you. So there's not a whole lot of editing, or actually no editing, that has been done. So you're going to hear a lot more agreement from me as the host than what you normally do, because I usually edit that part out. So apologies for that in advance, but I wanted to go ahead and get this interview out. Mark and I spoke several weeks ago, and I want to go ahead and get this out because I think it's great content, and it'll give you some great ammunition to use in your crusade against prohibition. As promised, my guest today is Mark Thornton. He is a senior fellow at the Mises Institute. He serves as the book review editor of the Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics. He is the author of several books, including topics on the prohibition of drugs, the economics of the American Civil War, and the Skyscraper Index. And the reason I've invited him on today is to talk about his writing on the prohibition of drugs. So without further delay, let's welcome Mark to the program. Dr. Thornton, welcome to the program.
Rachel, it's great to be with you.
Yeah, I had a guest on a few months ago, Chris Calton. We had gotten on the topic of the Iron Law of Prohibition, and Chris said, well, the guy you really need to talk to about this is Mark Thornton. So I wanted to have you on today to talk about the Iron Law of Prohibition.
That's great. Chris was a research fellow here at the Mises Institute several times, and I'm one of the faculty directors of that program. And first of all, I'd like to encourage all of your listeners to visit us online at mises.org. Yes, and with respect to the Iron Law of Prohibition, I went to graduate school at Auburn University, which is across the street. Mm-hmm. And one day, one of our professors asked us, with prohibition of alcohol, would you expect the quality to go up or down? And I raised my hand and said it would go down. And everybody else in the room agreed. He said, no, it would go up. And his rationale, he said that was a prelim question at the University of Chicago's economics PhD program. And his rationale was that during alcohol prohibition, it was very easy to slip high-quality Canadian whiskeys and scotch across the border and into Chicago. And so I was very puzzled about that, because in my experience and what I knew of this market is that the quality of illegal drugs was very inferior to what you would expect to get on the marketplace. Mm-hmm. And so that set me off on the journey of trying to find a rationale as to how could you have two answers in the opposite direction to the same question. And what I eventually found was that using my professor's rationale is that if people are going to try to smuggle drugs into the U.S., first of all, because something like cannabis is illegal everywhere at the time, so it's going to be produced not commercially in South America, for example. It's going to be produced illicitly. And so the standards are not very good. And the same applies to heroin and cocaine and other illegal drugs. But what I've found really interesting was that because the cost of crossing that border between South America and the United States is so high in terms of the risk involved for smugglers, was that fixed cost encouraged the production and distribution of more potent cannabis, cocaine, and heroin. And so that's basically the basis of the Iron Law of Prohibition, was that fixed cost of crossing the border led to higher potency and sometimes inferior quality products to cross that border. And so I wrote that paper and I distributed it amongst my friends, fellow students, and so forth, and some Washington, D.C. think tanks. And lo and behold, about a year later, it was written up in I think it was the Washington Times or the Washington Post, by the president of NORML, and he dubbed it the Iron Law of Prohibition.
Okay.
That whenever you prohibit something, you're going to make it more potent and lower quality and more dangerous.
Now, this is in the late 80s when you wrote this. So I can't imagine that you were terribly popular, because this was kind of the height of the just say no era.
Yeah, I didn't know it at the time. It was the mid 80s that I wrote the paper.
Mm-hmm.
And then it was 1986 when it was dubbed the Iron Law of Prohibition. And I started writing a dissertation on that subject, which I completed in 1988, 1989.
Mm-hmm.
And but my dissertation committee, when I originally proposed it in around 1986, I didn't hear back from them. And I went in and made an initial proposal to my committee, and they rejected it. And it was a standard book-length dissertation, the
Mm-hmm.
old-fashioned way. And they suggested that instead that I do the new approach to writing a dissertation, which is a 3-essay, 3-article dissertation. So you write 3 articles on, the copper industry of Chile. And what I was told to do is to write 3 essays on the 1920s, because I had already done one on public finance, and it was soon to be published. And then, of course, I had one on alcohol prohibition in draft form.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'd also done preliminary work on income distribution in the 1920s. So I was disappointed because I really thought the economics of prohibition approach would be a much better dissertation. But I realized that, with this suggestion by the committee to write 3 essays, I could be done very quickly, have 3 chapters to be submitted to journals. And then, so I wrote all that up, and I went in for a second proposal. And I made my presentation, and I left so that they could debate it. And it took them a long time. It was almost an hour long. And I was very curious, if not afraid, of what was going to come out of there. So they came back out, and they said, "We reject this proposal as well. We want you to do the first one on the economics of prohibition." And Rachel, it's only been in the last few years that I realized that the committee was afraid for me to write on this war on drugs type of thing, and that they were very careful. They were very worried of what this might mean for the economics department, for my job prospects. What would the university say? How would it affect federal funding? So it was a rather risque type of thing to do in the second half of the 1980s.
Mm-hmm.
Well, fortunately, it all worked out. I eventually turned the dissertation, published it as a book with the University of Utah Press, and so it turned out to be very successful and less confrontational than I think my committee thought. But like you suggested, it was a very risque type of a project to do back in the 1980s.
Right. I just remember all the propaganda from that time and just say no. Nancy Reagan's on TV talking about how bad it is to do drugs. And then Mark Thornton is here writing a paper about how it's not really a good thing.
Well, and it's particularly damning to the war on drugs because it's not a cost-benefit analysis, where these are the costs and these are the benefits. It's really no. There are no benefits. It's all cost. The more you spend, the more you lock up, the more you throw away people in the war on drugs, the worse the product is going to become. The more dangerous the product is going to become. And it also shows that not only does the war on drugs raise the potency of cannabis, which I showed in my dissertation, it rose from 0.4% THC in 1972 to 4.4% in 1984, and of course it rose much higher into the 10% range in recent years prior to the legalization movement. And then of course it also pushes markets, smugglers, producers away from marijuana, which is bulky to begin with, into things like cocaine, which it did. You'll remember in 1984 there was a federal operation conducted by the drug czar, Vice President Bush, to surround Florida and to swarm it with police, the military, and so forth to cut down on cannabis imports. And sure enough, cannabis temporarily disappeared from the streets, but it launched the whole cocaine market in the United States. And then shortly thereafter, of course, crack was developed. And so you get those kinds of results of not just one drug becoming more potent, but moving the market from less potent, less dangerous products to more potent, more dangerous products.
Yeah, and didn't something similar happen in Vietnam? I read, and I don't have any source for this. I just remember I remember reading it or seeing it somewhere that like Vietnam vets, they started saying, hey, quit doing cannabis. And so the vets moved from cannabis to using heroin. That's so much better, right?
Yeah, well, that's for a lot of different reasons. But they did do that. Many American soldiers came back from Vietnam as heroin addicts. Fortunately, a good proportion of them could give that up. That they could go back to, for example, cannabis. And given that they were no longer in the war, they didn't really need that high stimulation, dangerous that heroin brings. But also, for example, cannabis. If you're smoking cannabis, it has a strong odor. And the enemy can be alerted to your position. So for a lot of reasons, cost, detection, so forth, we had a big heroin problem with the soldiers, especially the draftees.
Yeah, it's kind of similar to that. You're probably aware of that experiment with the Rat City thing, where they put these rats in this high stress situation and they chose to use the water bottle that had the drugs in it. But then when they put them back into like normal population, they just drank normal water.
Yes. I've heard of that study and it makes a lot of sense. I mean, people turn to drugs for various reasons, but one of them is definitely stress and definitely, physical, emotional, psychological stress is going to lead people to drink alcohol, smoke marijuana, smoke cigarettes, and in extreme cases, using heroin to try to alleviate the problems of everyday life. And, we've got a big problem with that in the United States. We've got, 100 million plus adults that suffer from chronic pain. And, the physicians really can't do much to help all of these people. and in my mind, it's definitely a stress-related phenomenon. You know, back a couple of decades ago, we saw a similar phenomenon with an unusual number of people um, developing stomach problems.
Mm-hmm.
And as soon as they discovered, the cause, the physical cause, and they had a remedy, people dropped that problem, stomach problems and ulcers and things like that, and it moved on to other areas. So we've got to recognize, first and foremost in this world, that the stress of everyday modern life is highly problematic, and and people are reaching out for ways of stymieing that stress. And cannabis is probably one of the best and less problematic outlets for the relieving of stress, because it's a stress reducer. It does all these sorts of good things for health. It makes you less anxious. It makes you be able to rest and sleep. It encourages you to eat. It relieves anxiety. And so for all of those reasons, those low primary medical uses for cannabis, it can be used for medical treatment in various ways, the foundational ways as well as more specific ways. But it also, of course, helps millions of people relieve the regular chronic stress of everyday modern life.
Yeah, I think one of the things that, because I bought the whole narrative. I bought the reefer madness. You're gonna kill your parents if you use drugs. I bought it hook, line, and sinker. Of course, we were propagandized almost 24/7, it seems. And when I discovered that this plant is not anything that they've told us that it is, it really made me pretty angry. And I think a lot of people that have found healing through cannabis feel it very much the same way, that we have been lied to for practically 90 years about a plant.
Yes, that's right. The whole reefer madness thing is laughable in retrospect, but basically movie producers, they had to put out, when they wanted to produce a movie, they had to put out a B movie along with it, which is sort of a cheap offshoot type of a movie. And the idea that cannabis, or marijuana as it was known, could cause you to go insane, to cause you to become violent, murderous, become a rapist, and then it would kill you, of course, too, made for a quick, easy movie plot where, you see somebody who tries it and then goes off, becomes a crazy monster. So that was pretty funny in retrospect, but that never really affected me because I'll tell you this story. My father was a pharmacist, and our family had bought a old 19th century pharmacy in my hometown, operated it for many decades, and they kept all of the original pharmacy equipment. So, the jars and the pill making apparatus, and all sorts of drawers, for ingredients and that kind of thing. And when I was about 10 or 11, my father decided to take some of that stuff up. He had expanded the pharmacy, and he created a sort of a museum display of 19th century pharmacy equipment. And it had all sorts of jars and big glass bowls and that kind of thing. And it was all filled up. So he'd take one bowl and put it with water, and then maybe a blue dye in it, and then the red dye in another one. And so this is about the time of Nixon's war on drugs.
Mm-hmm.
And, the propaganda was all coming back and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And I looked in the encyclopedia, and I found out that marijuana was actually called Cannabis sativa or Cannabis indica.
Mm-hmm.
And I was working in the pharmacy one Saturday, And I looked up there, and two giant jars, glass jars, were up there, and one said Cannabis sativa, the other one said Cannabis indica,
Mm-hmm.
and it was filled to the brim with vegetative matter.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, oh my God, my father's got like 50 pounds of marijuana right here in the store. And so I was very, very concerned. I remember even shaking at the time.
Oh, wow.
But later in the day, I got the nerve up to ask my father when he came around outside where he dispensed the pills. I said, Dad, what is all this stuff? And he said, well, this is the way, pharmacies used to work. They had to actually make pills and make tonics and concoctions. You couldn't just send away for, specific pills of a specific size pills or, whatever, milligrams. You actually had to make them. I said, well, what, for example, is that? And I pointed directly to the Cannabis sativa container. And he said, oh, we used to use that in the old days to make a liniment for horses. And he said, a long time ago, when spring came around, they used horses to plow the fields, and the horses' legs would be very, very sore. So we made this liniment so that farmers put that on the legs of the horses in order to solve the problem. And then later, when they were no longer using horses like that, but they were using race horses, so they apply it to the race horses' legs after a race. And so I tried to digest that, but basically what it meant was that cannabis actually had a legitimate use. And that use was further legitimized by the fact that farmers and horse racers are not going to buy something and put it on the legs of horses if it doesn't actually work. And so I realized at age 12 that, the government story on marijuana was absolutely wrong, that it wasn't dangerous, that it was effective. And so its class 1 rating by the federal government was absolutely nothing but a lie. And then, of course, as I grew up, the government took us off the gold standard. The government was, mired in the war in Vietnam. We had Watergate, we had price controls, we had gas lines. And so as a young kid, I think I was actually fortunate to learn this lesson that big government was a lie, basically.
Well, that's pretty good, because I think most of us go through our government education feeling like that is not the case, that government has all the answers and that we can turn to them for everything that we need. And that they always tell us the truth.
And we don't have to pay for any of it. It's all just free.
Right.
It's just free things from Washington, free things from state capitol. But, it wasn't, none of this was pleasant, of course. And it was all, indirectly, my father and my mother, they weren't trying to make me a libertarian. They weren't libertarians. They were just business people. I remember even younger, I think it was in the late 1960s, I was working in the pharmacy, and my father was doing paperwork in the office, and he came storming out mad as hell. He said, "You're not going to become a pharmacist." I said, "Dad, what's the matter?" He said, "I just got some regulations from Washington, and I'm no longer going to be able to charge the prices that I decide. The government, via Medicare and Medicaid, is going to decide what prices I can charge my customers." And he said, "So this business of being an independent pharmacy is over." And he didn't have access to the maneuvers that chain pharmacies had available to them, where they would buy from a producer, which would go to a wholesaler that they controlled and could mark up the price so that once it got to the pharmacy, that the government price would be still profitable for them, but for the independent pharmacies, that wasn't going to be the case. And he saw the writing on the wall, that big government was destroying small independent pharmacies, as they did, with a lot of types of businesses.
Yeah, and I think we see that a lot, where even recently in the shutdown, and this may be a little controversial with some of our listeners, that these government shutdowns, they didn't affect Amazon, they didn't affect Walmart, but they sure did affect the mom and pop stores that could no longer have their storefront open and who didn't have a huge web presence.
Yeah, and a lot of these small family businesses are not going to be able to come back online. They've already been driven into bankruptcy. Like in my state of Alabama, the liquor stores were deemed absolute necessities, but churches were closed.
Yeah.
The hairstylist was closed. The nail salons were closed. These are all small family independent businesses, restaurants, of course, that were absolutely slammed by the lockdowns in all the various states. And, but Walmarts could stay open. Amazon, of course, was not shut down. It was only enriched by the shutdown because it was one of the few ways you could get certain products. And so, and the lockdown is controversial because we're not really even sure if it was beneficial. I mean, if you could quarantine all retired people and keep them away from everybody else could still go about their business with little chance of, there would be a good chance of catching the virus, but very, 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 very low chance of actually dying from the virus or even becoming symptomatic. I mean, it's unclear whether it's 30 or 50 or 70% of the people who contract the disease show any symptoms. So that's very, very controversial. And of course, one of the things that I've been studying and been reading about is all the negative consequences for health because of the lockdown itself, in terms of obviously suicides and obviously excessive drinking, lack of exercise, because the gyms are all shut down, all the emotional problems, the psychological problems, and the physical problems. For example, my doctor said that if you're isolated, that your immune system starts to weaken, and that our immune systems are bolstered by the fact that we come in contact with a multitude of things like viruses and other pathogens that regularly, day to day, hour to hour, are working our immune system. It's hard to quantify those kind of things, but some people think that the health costs of the lockdown exceeded any benefits. There's a group that I'm just reading about called Just Facts, and they think that in terms of the years of human life that was lost, not the number of deaths, but the number of human life years that resulted from all this stress, was many times greater than what they predicted in terms of the number of human life years gained. And so everything about that lockdown is very controversial. And I think we need to, study how different countries and indeed how different states approach this whole problem, and so that we're good and ready for one of these things that's inevitably going to happen in the future. One of the things that I find very perplexing is that in the mainstream media and politicians, and particularly the mainstream media, there's been as far as I could tell, almost no mention of the role that vitamin D and the sunshine vitamin, what role it plays in your immune system.
Or I've seen articles where it kind of poo-poos the idea that vitamin D could actually boost the immune system.
Yes, and of course, vitamin D is touted outside of the mainstream media. I've read at least a dozen summaries of research projects on this, and almost it's uniformly found to be beneficial or highly beneficial in upgrading your immune system, fighting off the disease in conjunction with, of course, other vitamins and minerals that are necessary. And what strikes me is two things that are conclusive on this. We're getting further away from cannabis, but
yeah, we'll have to get back to that here in just a second.
Yeah, but a couple of anecdotes. One personal, which is my grandmother and grandfather and a couple of my great aunts would travel to Florida after New Year's Day and spend 2 or 3 weeks in Florida, and they would take a room at a cheap motel, old Florida motels, not by the coast, but just somewhere in, off the beaten path. And they would go outside during the day, out the back door of their hotel rooms, and sit in chairs and sit in the sun. And they would do that for 2 or 3 weeks or more. And I've seen pictures of them, because I was never there, but I've seen pictures of them. And my grandmother and grandfather are in shorts and in T-shirts. And I've never, ever saw my grandparents in shorts or T-shirts, period.
Yeah.
But when they were down there to get the sun and to restore the amount of vitamin D that's stored in their livers. And so that's a personal story, a personal anecdote and where that comes from is that during the Spanish flu of 1918, where 50 million people died, including more than 10 million in the United States, if I remember correctly, the medical system was so overwhelmed that they decided to house a lot of the patients outside in military tents. So they had all this excess military supply from World War I. The world had been in battle for 4 years, and the food supply of the globe had been down by 25 to 50% in various areas that were under siege. And so everybody's immune system was compromised. And so the Spanish flu affected many, many people, but like in Boston and other cities where the hospital system was overwhelmed, they would put the people outside in these little white tents at night, and then in the day they would put them outside of the tent in the sun and in the fresh air. And what they found was that the people who were housed outside, their hypothesis is that the people outside would fare worse than the people in the hospital, but it turns out the people outside fared much better by being in the sun and the fresh air compared to the people who were in the nice beds inside the hospital. So that's when we knew that sunshine converted by the skin turned into vitamin D and made everybody healthier.
That's interesting. It's not something that they're proposing now. It's all stay inside, stay safe, when the very opposite needs to be done. But I mean, that's kind of the nature of central planning, is that they never seem to get it quite right.
They usually get it completely wrong.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's what Mises taught. And what he discovered was that central planning can't work. You cannot central plan an economy. It's impossible. And the reason it's impossible is that there's no private property, there's no market prices, and so you don't have the the signals that tell you, what to do, and if it's wrong or if it's right, if it's profitable, if it's unprofitable, and it leads to chaos.
As a family, we're reading a book on North Korea called Nothing to Envy. And it's stories of people who escaped from North Korea to South Korea. And the degree of control that the government has of every facet of life in North Korea just blows my mind. And like you said, it's not working. I don't know how well it's working now, but in the book, the way they describe it, there aren't those things that signal, hey, we should make more of this, we should make less of this, we should charge more for this, we should charge less for this. And none of those exist in that type of society.
Yeah, it's a tragedy. It's an absolute tragedy, North Korea. If your listeners go to a satellite imaging website and look at the world in that part of the world at night, you see lights in Japan and South Korea and China and elsewhere, and North Korea is completely dark.
It's pretty devastating, and it's the country is essentially like a giant prison camp for everybody that lives there. And then inside the giant prison camp, they have even worse prison camps.
Oh yeah, it's tragedy.
Well, we have gotten a little off topic, so I want to kind of steer us back. And I want to bring to your attention, and you're probably aware of this, but Alex Berenson wrote a book, I think in 2019, called Tell Your Children, which is kind of a play on the whole reefer madness thing. He says in that book, and also in a debate that he had with Jacob Sullum at the Soho Forum, that demand is what drives the THC levels of cannabis, and demand drives potency. Whereas what you found in your research is it's not demand. So I didn't know if you had a good comeback to what Alex is saying there, and I'm sure you do.
Oh, sure. I mean, that's the wrong approach. He's coming from a cultural island of, potheads that, that they're always looking for the most potent thing out there on the streets, and that they think they've scored if they get a more potent version of the product. But what we've seen, actually, if you take the whole marketplace, is that the buildup of THC in cannabis, the growers actually genetically engineered the product so you got more THC and less CBD. Mm-hmm. And as a result, consumers in the old days used to get what is referred to as getting high, because you had, an amount of THC and amount of CBD, which was balanced. And then over the years, growers have been able to genetically engineer cannabis so that it's very high in THC and very low in CBD. Mm-hmm. And so instead of getting high, then people started referring to getting stoned, mm-hmm. rather than getting high. And so that's what that's where we were when this legalization movement started to be successful. And now, of course, medical marijuana is supported by like 85 to 90% of Americans, and recreational cannabis is supported by 65% of Americans. And of course, hemp has been legalized everywhere, mm-hmm. in the United States. And so here in Auburn, Alabama, Lee County, which is maybe 100,000 people, we've had about a dozen different places selling hemp. And it's very, very popular. And, it's as a recreational device, and it's got very low THC, almost none, yeah, and very high CBD, which is also, one of the medical cannabinoids. And so what we've seen is that the legal cannabis is genetically engineered to achieve various results, various medical applications, various recreational applications. And so the whole drive to get, the THC level higher and higher has basically been stopped. And many more Americans are turning to, I guess, what you call recreational hemp flowers, which look like the cannabis, but it has almost no THC. And so I know several people who are been lifelong cannabis users, and they would say the same thing that the person you referred to, that demand wants higher and higher THC. Well, I've got to tell you, it's really not the case, because I know at least a handful of people who have stopped smoking cannabis and have started smoking hemp flowers that have virtually no THC whatsoever in them. I smoked cannabis for 46 years. And last year about this time, a friend of mine introduced me to hemp flowers, and I haven't had any cannabis since.
Yeah, I think in some states where it's been legalized, you've got consumers coming in and they don't want to get stoned. They want the lower THC and higher CBD, CBG, and all that good stuff. So I think there's an argument that can be made that there may be some demand out there for high THC products, but there's more for people, especially who are looking at this for medicinal purposes. They want to get a higher mix of cannabinoids and terpenes, not just high THC.
Yeah, so I think that argument has been stopped in its tracks. It doesn't make any theoretical sense. There may be a cultural element to it, a lingering cultural element, as all government interventions cause. So there's a lasting effect there, but I think the really high, no pun intended, cannabis with THC is used because they can specifically genetically engineer these stuff in a targeted way to medical uses. And so I think that's really shows that it's not demand that pushes up THC. It's prohibition that did it. And, sure, if you have, the same amount of one product and the same amount of another, one's higher in THC and they cost the same, consumers will probably switch, make the choice, especially in an illegal market, to get the higher THC one. That's, that's true. That is true. But once you legalize things and there's a fair playing field, then we've seen a tremendously different result. And, given that there's, 10 or 12 places in my area that sell this stuff and sell it, on a regular basis, it's their primary product. I mean, the stores might be filled with all sorts of pipes and bongs and other things, but their primary product is hemp flowers.
One of the other downsides to prohibition, in addition to it drives up potency, is also the level of violence that tends to surround these illegal markets.
Yes, that's right. I have a chapter in my book, The Economics of Prohibition. And by the way, your audience, if you Google my name, Mark Thornton, plus Mises.org, plus The Economics of Prohibition, plus PDF, you'll be taken to a link that will go to a page at Mises.org where you can download an electronic copy of my book for free.
Well, I'll make it even easier for them, and I'll put a link to the book on the show notes page for today's episode. But I also encourage people to go out to Mises.org and look up other articles that you've written, and just check out Mises.org altogether.
Yeah, I mean, if you go to mises.org and look up any topic, or even Google, so a lot of times I'll Google MISES.org and a specific topic. And then they tend to pry out more accurate results.
Mm-hmm.
And I've written on virtually everything that's happened in the war on drugs. From everything from Needle Park to various movies interpretations. I've been at this a long time, and we've got tons of other writers, up and coming writers that are writing, especially about this virus plague and lockdown,
Mm-hmm.
virtually every day. But in any case, and this is something that's still plaguing American cities is the violence and the corruption, all of the unintended consequences that people on the street are forced to endure because of the war on drugs. And in the book, I look at, number of deaths and number of overdoses and all sorts of things related to violence and corruption. It's really a horror story. And one thing I've been trying to get people to listen to is the fact that our war on drugs has really caused failed states in Central America, places
Mm-hmm.
like Honduras and Nicaragua and Costa Rica, Belize. The military, with the use of radar and so forth, has made transporting illegal drugs from South America to North America very difficult. We virtually shut off the idea that planes could fly loaded with drugs from South America to North America because the legitimate flights are known, so illegitimate flights can be tracked.
Mm-hmm.
The same is true with water transportation. So the only really viable way, risk-free way, to smuggle drugs from South America to North America is on land, through the jungles. And so the drug cartels have basically cordoned off huge areas in these countries that they control. They control by the use of violence, murder, rape, violence, beating people, raping people, threatening to do all of those things to people,
Mm-hmm.
threatening the local police, threatening local judges, even threatening local military units. And so they've taken over these areas, and they've caused failed states that can't enforce the law, states that can't control transportation routes. And as a consequence, people who are living or trying to live in these Central American countries are migrating to the United States. And so, even kids on their own without their parents are traveling, 900, 1,300 miles on their own trying to get into the United States and getting hooked up with maybe family members or former neighbors that have made it to the United States. It's very dangerous. And of course, President Trump thinks that all of this immigration is bad for the country, but it's being caused by the fact that it's our war on drugs. And so because the cartels have taken over these areas, nobody wants to invest in those countries. So there's no chance that Americans or Canadians or people in the UK would want to invest in these areas in terms of crops or manufacturing or textiles or, create jobs down there. So there's no jobs as well. So we've completely destroyed these states, and we're causing an exodus of these poor people who don't speak English and who don't have any, jobs or anything. They're pushing them into the United States. It's our fault, and you can't sit down logically and come to any other conclusion, except the mainstream media never even mentions this.
Yeah, that's right. And it seems like the people who most support the policies on drug prohibition are also the ones that don't want immigrants coming to the country. So it's like, well, you can't support the war on drugs and then say we don't want any immigrants to come to this country, because the two are connected.
Yes, it's they're just not well informed. They're probably not well educated. You know, the original Republican Party, one of the biggest components of the original Republican Party was the former Know Nothing Party. The people who claimed to know nothing, that they opposed immigration. They wanted, a static situation. That was incorporated into the original Republican Party, along with the Whigs and the Prohibitionists and things of that nature. And we see that coming forward to today, that the Republican Party consists of Whig-like politicians who support protectionism, prohibitionists who support the war on drugs, and the know-nothings who oppose immigration and who oppose minorities. So it hasn't changed any really since the
They
very
still
beginning.
know nothing after all these years.
Yes, they just want what they want, and they don't want to know anything about the implications of what they want.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and at this point, it's almost willful ignorance. If you have even the most basic understanding of economics, you could see plain as day what happens when you prohibit a plant or you prohibit alcohol, and they just refuse to see it. And they didn't learn any lessons from alcohol prohibition, except that, we don't even have to pass an amendment to the Constitution. We'll just declare these plants illegal by edict.
Yes, and that's basically what happened with narcotics in 1914 and with cannabis in 1937. They passed an edict that was regulatory in nature, and then the regulators just imposed a prohibition. Instead of allowing something under constraints, they just said, no, you can't have it. That's it.
Well, Mark, do you have any suggestions for, say somebody wants to go and do something that seems like a waste of time and talk to a legislator? How do we get across to them that prohibition doesn't work, that it hasn't made us safer, it hasn't reduced the number of drugs on the street? How do we get that across to them, that they're not protecting us, they're not helping us, they're just making the problem so much worse?
Well, there's two direct ways that you can get started today, really. It requires an ideological change. And you can see this in demographics, where the ideological change takes place. And with cannabis, it was younger, more educated people who supported legalization, and older, less educated people supported prohibition. And so to change prohibition requires ideas and science. And then it gets melded into an ideology, a sort of a libertarian ideology. And so listeners can start by learning themselves, get my book, get all the articles on our site and other sites. There are organizations that are specific to this cause, such as NORML and other groups out there, the Drug Policy Alliance. There's many of them that you can list on your show notes. Learn some things and start posting them on social media. Mm-hmm. With a short explanation, a short synthesis of what you read, and then a link to what you read, and try to do that as often as you can. Mm-hmm. And the other is to get hooked up with the local efforts, organizations to legalize cannabis in your own state, and try to get involved at least to some extent. I'm not a huge advocate of political action, but I think if we can start to change ideology, mm-hmm. And we can introduce solid ideas like the Iron Law of Prohibition, and you can also go to Wikipedia and look various things up regarding the war on drugs and the Iron Law of Prohibition, and see what those local organizations are doing to try to, in order to try to legalize and deregulate cannabis, and also, of course, there's problems with legalized cannabis, such as high taxation in certain states, such as high regulation in certain states. The fact that cannabis stores are prevented from using the banking system causes problems. So there's still a lot of, even if your state has legalized, there's still a lot of problems that need to be brought to the public's attention so that we can normalize this business as much as possible. And then, of course, with the harder drugs, I advocate an approach that is professional, medical, and commercial. That is, that things like cocaine and heroin and other things need to be made commercially rather than illicitly. They need to be there needs to be a situation where doctors can provide prescriptions to the commercial products, supervise the addicts, maybe in return for some counseling or something like that, so that at least the addicts to pain medication and because a lot of the pain medication that's sold illicitly is also made illicitly.
Right.
So I think if we can commercialize production, professionalize distribution, and allow addicts to switch from being an illegal addict to a monitored patient, needs to be an option out there. And there's no way that that's going to make things worse, basically. It's going to make it better. It's going to give people an alternative. If they know that they can get a maintenance dose of a product at a reasonable price, then they can start putting their lives together. Because heroin addiction, for example, it's not just the product that you're ingesting that might kill you if it's made incorrectly, but also chances are your economic situation is a mess, your family situation is a mess, your relationship status is a mess. Everything about your life, unless you're really wealthy, is going to be a mess. So that's an alternative. It's the same sort of approach to cannabis, except it's more in a more regulated fashion where you're under the supervision of a doctor or a therapist.
In Johann Hari's book, The Chasing the Scream, he talks about that in these places where people could get safe legal access to drugs, instead of what you think, where drug use and drug abuse go up, it actually decreases, and these people are able to kind of rejoin society and work because they know where their next fix is coming from.
Yeah, it's an absolutely debilitating situation, and I have to go by what I can read about this, but I think that is definitely the right approach. It's definitely an option that needs to be available, and I think as a result, obviously, you're not going to have nearly as many overdoses or overdose deaths in this situation, and you're not going to have the street people dying in the streets nearly as much. So that's something we're going to have to work on as well. It's a huge problem. We're starting to solve the problem of illegal cannabis, and it's something that I'm incredibly optimistic about. I mean, as you can imagine, coming from the mid-1980s, to studying this problem under the most severe period of the war on drugs, economists Bruce Benson and David Rasmussen from Florida State University wrote a book, and they show, based on a statistical analysis, that the height of the war on drugs was from 1985 to 1989, And to come from that period under those circumstances to where we are today, I mean, I'm incredibly gratified and incredibly optimistic of what's coming forward because the demographics are incredibly in our favor in that the only demographic group right now, if I can remember correctly, is people 65 and older with a high school education or less. So that one demographic is, going to be essentially, in the coming years, they're going to fade off the ideological scale, and people who have grown up in a legal environment and can actually see what's going on, and they can actually experience what's going on. You've got to be incredibly optimistic.
Mm-hmm.
Plus the fact that we're in an economic crisis means that governments at all levels are going to be seeking new revenue sources. And I'm not a big advocate of high taxes on cannabis. I think there shouldn't be any special taxes or regulations on cannabis, but it would still be a revenue source for local, county, state, and federal governments, just because, well, it creates jobs, it creates sales tax, it creates license fees. And, back in the early 30s, at the depth of the Great Depression, I'd like to think that people learned their lesson about all of the murders and violence and overdose, alcohol deaths, ruined livers, crime, corruption, especially. I'd like to think that people learned their lesson, but also local, state, and federal governments were all urgently needing more sources of revenues. They were having to cancel schools and cannibalize fire departments and police departments. We were in really a desperate situation that we find ourselves in again today.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I can almost guarantee you that in a very short period of time, you're going to see some new legislation, new judicial edicts, and so forth that are going to really open up this market nationwide, indeed worldwide. Because, you got to remember, these state referendums, they're in violation of federal and international law. So this is the biggest slap in the face that the federal government has experienced, certainly in my lifetime. And so states are learning that they have a degree of power and that the feds really can't enforce their prohibition because they know that if they bring cases to trial, that the juries are not going to convict.
Yeah.
And so, it's sort of a nullification of federal power here. And, states were also responsible for these lockdowns. It wasn't a federal mandate. It was all done by the states. And so states are learning that they do have a separate and distinct authority. And so I'm also incredibly optimistic and hope that we continue to go in that direction as well.
It's hopeful. I mean, I wish we could get to a point where we could legalize the stuff without it being seen as a revenue stream for government. But I guess, incrementalism will take what we can get.
Yeah, I mean, that's always something difficult for academics. You see the answer, that ultimately that'll be better for society, but in the real world, the political process is one of fits and starts and setbacks too. And but eventually we'll get to, if we continue to push the science and the ideology of freedom forward, I mean, I think that we're going to win ultimately. And I think that, that if there's any silver lining to this pandemic and lockdown businesses, that the government really doesn't know what it's doing. And the whole idea that, federal experts can work ourselves out of problems is going to be increasingly seen as highly problematic and counterproductive.
I would think with 40 million people now unemployed because of the lockdowns, and I don't think it's because of the virus. I think it's because of the lockdowns. You would think that more and more people would realize that, central planning doesn't work and the government doesn't know how to solve all our problems.
That's right. And, on top of that, we can do a pretty good job of working through such problems, by individuals, entrepreneurs working independently.
Yeah, because, the free market can address these needs a lot better than the government can, because they move at a glacial pace, but you and I both know this.
Right.
Well, Mark, I really appreciate your time and coming on and talking to us about the Iron Law of Prohibition. And I hope folks will, like I said, I'll link to your book and then also some other related articles and resources in the show notes for today's episode. I highly encourage everybody to go check out Mark's book and also Mises.org.
It's been fun. Glad to be on your program.
Yeah, absolutely. It's my pleasure.
Have a good day.
Thanks, you too, Mark. Show notes for today's episode will eventually be out at cannabishealsme.com/115. As I mentioned at the top of the show, I am working on a tax filing deadline. Hopefully, I will get that put to bed here in the next day or two, and then I can go out and focus on the website for the podcast and get that link uploaded. We will not have a show this coming Monday because I don't have any interviews lined up. I've got a couple of folks I've been talking to, but nothing nailed down. So we will be back when we get back. And that's why you should go out and subscribe to the podcast so that it will automatically download to your feed when we have a new show. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for enduring with me during all these times where I've missed shows, missed weeks, or whatever. If you like what we're doing here, tell your friends about it. We would certainly appreciate you helping us get the word out about the healing power of cannabis, and then also the many reasons that this plant should no longer be illegal. Thanks again, guys, for listening. You guys have a great weekend.